Whatever was here lies buried in the mists of antiquity. An abbey? Maybe. A house and garden? Certainly. The name has survived. Abbey Hill, or the Hill of the Abbot. That's from the 7th century, at the height of the monastic period, when these fields belonged to the nearby monastery of Louth. By the 13th century, the name had changed to Knockabbey under the new Anglo-Norman order. What we do know is that these lands were fought over for centuries. They changed hands, were bartered in marriage and politics, mortgaged and remortgaged. Monastic, medieval, Elizabethan, Cromwellian, whether won by conquest, by trade, or shifting political loyalties, each dynasty put down its roots, marked the landscape. The family names changed: Bellew, Barton, Tennyson, O'Reilly, and in more recent times, O'Brien.
I first saw it on the front page of the property section of the Tribune. I wasn't looking for a place, but it had some interesting aspect about it, and I decided I'd go and look at it. I developed property, and I had just sold the property and was cash rich just then. So it was completely whimsical. I wasn't looking for a place. It wasn't an alternative home. It was just impulse.
Today, if you have an eye for it, you can decipher the times through the building. The Bellews built a tower house in the 1300s to establish their Anglo-Norman hold. Later, in an outbreak of peace, the Tennysons felt secure enough to make habitation and build a residence onto the tower house in the late 1600s, just as their landed counterparts were doing in fashionable England.
Well, I think if you look at the front facade, it's very clear the different periods of construction that have been carried out on the building. From the left, if you look at the tower house, you can see the type of windows, for example, and compare those to the windows on what is the Queen Anne period house. They're completely different, both in terms of their shape and in terms of their regularity on the facade. The tower house would appear to have been constructed in around the 14th to 15th century. The building to the right, which we have called the Queen Anne period house, is sometime around 17th to 18th century. The tower house would have been a building outside of the Pale or on the edge of the Pale, and for that reason would have had to have a very defensive nature to it. Whereas when one compares it to the Queen Anne period house, the ground floor is habitated completely, and the windows, completely all defensive nature has gone from the building. It is lived in, and it shows a people that are established in their area, in the landscape, and that have become more accepted by the people around them.
My idea was to spend a relatively small amount of money on it, putting in a few comforts like extending the central heating, a lick of paint, as they say, pull down the wing attached to the tower house, and tidy up the garden. So I went through a phase of putting a hotel here, and I actually got planning permission for a state-of-the-art futuristic Japanese-style building, 20-bedroom building. I was never convinced that it would work. I didn't want to be running a small hotel here in a back road off a back road, and it would have to have been very specialist. So that idea started to wobble, and then one weekend I had a friend of mine here, Dermot O'Neill of RT gardening fame, and he started to rave about the trees, which to me were just parkland trees, and it was him that identified the remnants of a fine old garden.
it suddenly became of much greater interest to develop the gardens, and the realization that they would be in themselves a very significant tourist attraction. Garden restoration, again, is a relatively new thing in this country. I mean, there's been a lot of significant projects in the last 10 years, but it's a relatively new thing. This part of Ireland, in fact, has very, very little in that regard.
Dermot then put me in contact with Finola Reid and the Great Gardens of Ireland.
I had to see them on site, I had to walk the site, listen to them, because some of the judgment in terms of giving a grant to a particular property was whether the people themselves were interested in doing it properly, were they going to listen to professional advice, and were they prepared to employ that professional advice to do it, because a lot of people think they know everything about their own garden.
Her attitude was convince me. The very minute she was convinced, then she was behind it full and very helpful.
We needed a profile of ownership where the people were going to be there, going to be interested, prepared to spend the money, prepared to do it right, and then in return for the grant they were prepared to open for tourism afterwards.
So the gardens were the thing. Would I go that route? The history forced us to do that in a sense. I moved away from the commercial aspect, as I said, and it'll just be gardens open to the public to defray the costs of some of the gardening.
Belinda Jupp and Thomas McAlane, historical archaeologists, proceeded to carry out a full survey of the pleasure grounds at Knockabbey.
I was brought in to assess whether there were elements here of sufficient importance that should be preserved and restored. Within a very short time into the survey, I was extremely impressed by the rarity value of some of the features here. It was never a great garden, but what was very important about it was that it was a rare survival of a small domain belonging to the minor gentry.
For our purposes, a claim now, your next claim, and probably one after that.
With the survey complete and the Great Gardens of Ireland grant awarded, a team of professional advisors was put in place to oversee the revival of the house and garden.
Yeah. You know, so you'll have that in November, and I would suspect early December.
Yeah, well, 4 patches, slightly proud of our level with the cobbles.
One of the key appointments at the outset of the project was Deirdre Rutledge to oversee the restoration of the gardens.
And the first visit you just sort of recognise how lovely it is and all that, but then you have to sit down and set a plan. I suppose the first thing was divide it into its different sections and the different plan of action for each area, and then just plan around how to go about that and when to go about it. And there's a lot of constraints involved as well, and be it budget or time, and the whole seasonality of the nature of this work means that you can only do certain jobs at certain times. So there was all that to be taken into account, but I mean, it is a huge challenge, but surmountable.
Another key man was Teddy Duffy, who as site foreman identified some major requirements if the project was to succeed.
Initially, when we took the job on, we found that we were going to need some of the old craftsmen that were about long ago, and that wasn't possible to find too many of those, but we had to have that kind of skills. And when you go to look for that kind of skills nowadays, you've got a big problem doing that, because like with modern technology and everything seems to be speed now, massive production, and finishing late with shorter working hours. Whereas when you had skills long ago with the older craftsmen and that, time was of no importance nearly at all. The thing that was important was quality workmanship and that.
An understanding of past occupancy was key to Thomas McAlane's assessment of the project.
2 very formative periods in garden history were represented here. We had a phase of about, from say 1720 to 1730 under the Tennysons, under Richard Tennyson, and he had laid out a very elaborate water garden with formal canals, little garden buildings, all laid out in sort of straight lines, intimate spaces. And then the property seemed to go to sleep for maybe 150 years or so until about 1860, when Miles O'Reilly enlarged the domain, created a landscape park, added new buildings in the Gothic style to suit the origins of Thomastown Castle, renamed it Knockabbey, And it's interesting that it was a blend of Victorian formalism with terracing around the house, but also he created a parkland, long views, naturalistic landscape.
From its walls and battlements, history has been recorded here. The Bellews, having survived the Cromwellian wars, were temporarily transported to Connaught for backing the wrong side, that of James II. War, war again, famine, and finally, peace. The arrival in the 18th century of what was to be 6 generations of the O'Reilly family marked a defining period in the development of Thomastown Castle and Gardens. This was the ancestral home of the O'Reillys, who reclaimed it in the 1800s.
There's a lovely social history of families, the rise and fall of families, but at no time in its history was there a wealthy family here. You get the impression they're always chasing the devil by the tail and hanging on, and that is so Irish, and it's the whole history of the Irish minor gentry.
The modern history of Knockabbey belongs to those same O'Reillys, a colourful family. They had a military pedigree that saw them raise an army of Irish exiles which took part in the Italian Civil War, defending the Pope against Garibaldi. But they always came back to what they regarded as their real home at Knockabbey in County Louth. In 1916, members of the O'Reilly family fought for the Revolutionary Army of the New Republic. But even that did not save their ancestral home. During the early 1920s, Republicans burned out Knockabbey in what one local historian called a piece of incendiary barbarism.
You can see behind me the 1920s edition, which was built following the burning down of the house during the War of Independence. And one thing which we looked at and immediately sprang to our minds when we saw it was the finish that's on that is rubble stone, which wouldn't seem to be very apt for the site in general. But when you have to imagine that this building was built in 1920, so in order to keep the character of the house and the buildings themselves as being of separate eras, I think we should leave it as it is for future generations to realise that there was, 3 different phases of work involved in the construction of the house.
The current restoration is an attempt to bring back to life many of the features of the old ornamental garden, 30 acres in all, including a mid-18th century waterscape.
It has just become totally overgrown here over the years, and it's an area that has been fairly neglected because I suppose it's furthest away from the house, and it's become very overgrown with trees, vegetation. All the water areas have become sludged up with leaves over time and branches of trees and whatever. So we're at the stage now where we're doing quite a lot of tree surgery and cleaning out of the waterways as much as is possible.
The ponds or early canals would have been fish ponds. They would have simply been fish ponds. We haven't identified where the old abbey may have stood here, and this is only part of the estate of that old Knockabbey. And we think that the fish ponds were part of that early period when it would have been a necessity to have fresh fish. So fresh fish out of your pond was one of the basics of life, in the same way as you get them in the very old gardens in Italy. We looked at some old photographs, and lo and behold, in one of the photographs, just in the very distance, when you study the photograph very, very carefully, an old black and white photograph, here was the greenhouse. And you can see on the old outside wall of the old walled garden where that greenhouse once stood. So we were able to get more detail from the old photograph as to how it looked. And now what's been put up is a replica of the style of one that would have been there.
This is a gardener's house here. We're revamping it completely. That's by far the biggest part of the project. There's an awful lot of work to be done to it, which would include complete new windows, new doors, and a repainting of the outside of the building. We also had to repair the roof but we found the roof to be in very bad condition, so we had to put on a completely new roof. Again, using old slates, keeping the whole thing as it was before. As you go down the garden here, we have a fairing house which was in very, very bad condition. We re-roofed it completely, and we're replacing all the units in it, and we're repainting it totally in that.
One of the main features of the old water garden were pathways leading to an old stone building, a tea house, used as a soup kitchen in famine times, and a focal point at the end of a walk along the formal canals.
Originally we figured the building to be round, but on investigation we discovered that it wasn't, so it raised a whole lot of problems in terms of trying to keep the walls plumb, you know. Nobody seems to know whether the Gothic style windows and castellations were there to begin with. Again, you know, it's the architect's impression of perhaps what might have been there based on what they see, you know, from the main house, in terms of the castellations in it and the classic Gothic front entrance to the house. You know, that's sort of try to mirror that in many respects.
Oh my God. Yeah. Just from this elevation now, looking at it, it looks kind of small.
With much of the restoration work now complete, Deirdre Rutledge takes Fionnuala Reid on a short tour of some of the main garden features.
The nice bit is starting to happen now because a lot of the grass areas are seeded. The lake has now been dug out and cleared. The ponds area are starting to look really good. You're getting wonderful reflection on the water now. And Deirdre now is getting to the nice bit, the satisfying bit, you know, the rewarding bit really for Deirdre.
One of the nice bits was the sourcing of authentic plants to put back into the garden.
We had to look at lists of plants to put back into the garden in the areas which had fallen into disrepair. So that meant getting out old books of the Victorian period and finding out what was typically planted then.
This is Mrs. Beaton's, is it?
Luckily, Deirdre came across a plant list of shrubs that had been in the garden in the O'Reilly's day.
What one is that one now?
You can get a lot for a feel of a place from the house records and any recorded information by the owners in the past, and that. It's a very important source, but does take a bit of detective work.
The wild, the ordinary.
I know a lot of people think gardening is all to do with colour and whatever, but it isn't really. You can do an awful lot with green. And I mean, you just sort of use the structure that's there and work with it and around it and whatever to create something special.
As the cycle of history inevitably repeats itself, here on a sunny spring day, descendants of those 6 generations of O'Reillys return. not to reclaim their ancestral lands, but rather to learn a little bit about their historic past.
The castle was always very scary, so you guys are so small, and it was huge. Coming back now, it looks tidy.
The main difference, of course, is
the ivy.
The ivy's gone.
I was born here in Knockabbey. I lived here for about 7 years. I came back on occasions for holidays and had a couple of Christmases here.
What do you think? Is it just because
we came back once or twice? In 1995, we came back and visited the castle when my grandmother was still alive.
Yes, it's nice to see it being restored like this.
Yeah. It's great seeing the exhibition, seeing where the O'Reillys come from and the history, the vast history. Miles William O'Reilly had the biggest impact on the castle. He lived here from 1844 to 1880, and he built the Victorian wing of the castle in 1860. Miles William O'Reilly fought in the Papal Wars. He was leader of the Irish Brigade, and he was presented with a medal from the Pope.
Some of the memories that come back to me are Christmases in the hall and family lunches in the dining room.
I have grown to love it, and I like it as a home. It's very warm and homely. It's not big and drafty. It has a character, and I came from the country originally, and I had decided I wanted to move a bit away from the speed of Dublin and the pressure of walking down the street, the pressure of people. So no, I've settled in here quite well, and I couldn't see myself walking away.
Discovering now in Ireland over the past 6 to 7 years, there's been a huge increase in visitors coming into Ireland and visiting historic properties and historic gardens. And in fact, the total visitor count for visitors to both historic houses and castles and gardens is actually higher than the number of visitors that comes to play golf. And it's a huge justification for the very modest amount of money we've actually spent throughout the country.
The formality around the castle, and we have the Victorian flower garden with its flowers and glass house, and the herbaceous border, which is quite formal. But then there's the parkland, which will be it'll be quite informal wildflower meadows, and then there's the water garden with its woodland and ponds and canals. So there's quite a selection and a variety that should cater to right from the specialist right down to the ordinary Sunday hobbyist.
I look forward to being able to share it with somebody. It's like having a good painting. You like to show it to your friends. This is possibly the most artistic thing I could do, putting this place back together. And it's like having something beautiful, like a nice painting or something. You like somebody to see it. You don't put it in a cupboard and leave it there.